217 kilometers from shore, no boats in sight. No life jacket. Only a German shepherd, fighting for its life. When fisherman Daniel Morgan spotted something bobbing in the middle of the ocean, he thought it was just a fin. But as he drew closer, his heart nearly stopped. It was a dog. Soaking wet, exhausted, struggling to stay afloat, utterly alone in the endless, unforgiving sea. No one could explain how the dog had ended up there. But what happened next defied all expectations and will leave you speechless. The sea was eerily calm. Deceptively so, the kind of stillness that makes seasoned fishermen uneasy. It was the calm that always comes before the storm. Miles from the Florida coast, 42-year-old Daniel Morgan steered his modest fishing boat through the open waters. He had set out before dawn, hoping to catch tuna. But after 6 long hours, the only things he'd caught were sunburn and silence. And then he saw it. At first, Daniel thought it was a fin, maybe debris carried by the current. But something about the way it moved, how it resisted the tide rather than flowing with it, made his heart pound faster. He grabbed his binoculars and focused. His heart skipped a beat. It was a dog. A German shepherd. Exhausted. Barely keeping its head above water. No land in sight. No boats nearby. Nothing. Daniel's stomach twisted. This wasn't just rare. It was impossible. How the hell? He muttered, already pushing the throttle towards the struggling animal. As he got closer, the reality became even more horrifying. The dog's legs were still paddling, but weakly and chaotically. Her head bobbed with every wave. Her mouth barely stayed above the surface. She only had minutes left, maybe less. Daniel cut the engine and shouted overboard. "Hey buddy, hang on. I'm coming for you." But the dog didn't respond. She was too weak. Her eyes were clouded with fear and exhaustion. Without hesitation, Daniel ripped off his shirt, threw a rope ladder over the side, and dove in. The water was colder than he expected, the salt stung his eyes, but he pushed through the waves, never looking away from the desperate shepherd. When he finally reached her, the dog's legs gave out completely. Her body collapsed into Daniel's arms like dead weight. Holding her with one arm, he kicked furiously, dragging her back to the boat. Reaching the ladder, Daniel pushed from below while the dog instinctively clawed upwards. Finally, they collapsed onto the deck, a trembling heap. Daniel followed, gasping for air. He dropped to his knees beside the dog, gently wiping the water from her face. Her chest rose faintly. Her fur was salty and matted. Her paws were raw. Her breathing was shallow but steady. "You're alive?" Daniel whispered softly. "You crazy, beautiful creature, you made it." He wrapped her in a dry tarp and grabbed a bottle of fresh water. The shepherd didn't move. Daniel sat beside her, his heart racing. He wasn't shaking from the cold. It was the sheer disbelief at what he had just witnessed. He looked out over the endless blue. "What were you doing out here, girl?" he asked quietly. The dog didn't answer, but something flickered in her amber eyes. Not fear, not pain, but something else. A quiet, unbreakable will to live. Daniel wrapped the tarp tighter around her fragile body and steered the boat back to the nearest marina. Almost 2 hours passed. The sun shifted, casting golden reflections across the waves. The dog never raised her head, just lay there, trembling. Every few minutes, Daniel glanced at her. She was still breathing, still alive. But the questions remained. No collar, no harness, no life vest, no tracker, nothing. The only clue was the rough, worn skin beneath her front legs, as if she had been swimming for hours, maybe longer. Daniel had seen dogs thrown from boats before. Cruel owners treating them like trash. But not this far from shore, not 217 kilometers. This was different. He gently placed his hand on the dog's back. "Do you have a name, girl?" There was no answer. Just the soft sound of her fragile breath and the infinite sea all around them. Daniel didn't even flinch. He carefully studied the dog's face. Her eyes were open, slightly wary, not trusting yet, but watching. When the boat finally reached the shore, Daniel didn't head straight to animal control. Something deep inside him resisted that idea. Instead, he lifted the weak and lethargic German Shepherd, placed her gently into his truck, and drove directly to a small veterinary clinic near Clearwater. As soon as he walked in, the receptionist looked up. "Sir, you can't just..." He almost drowned. 135 miles offshore, Daniel interrupted firmly. "No papers. No explanation. I just need someone to check him out." Silence filled the room. A young veterinarian appeared, eyes wide. "Did you say 135 miles from shore?" Daniel nodded gravely. "I found him swimming alone." Within moments, the dog was taken into a back room. Daniel sat alone in the waiting area, dripping with seawater and anxiety. He didn't even fully understand why he felt so attached to her already. Maybe it was because she hadn't given up, not even when the whole world seemed to say she should. 20 minutes later, the vet returned. "He's severely dehydrated, scratched up, and incredibly malnourished," she said, disbelief in her voice. "But his heart is strong. Strangely enough, he survived." Daniel exhaled in deep relief. "Thank God. No microchip," the vet added, "but we did find something odd." She handed Daniel a small, rusty piece of metal tangled in the fur near the dog's neck. It looked like part of a broken tag. Daniel turned it over in his fingers. Most of the engraving was worn away, only one letter remained, R. No number. No name. Just R. That night, Daniel took the dog home. His place was modest, a one-room cabin by the water, with peeling paint and an old dock out back. He laid out a folded blanket for the dog and set a bowl of water beside her. She still wouldn't eat, but her eyes followed him everywhere. Before bed, Daniel sat cross-legged beside her and whispered, "You survived something no dog should ever endure. I don't know how or why, but I promise, I won't let you go." The dog blinked slowly. Not trust, not yet. But something was there. Something growing. The next morning, Daniel woke to the sound of soft scratching on the wooden floor. For a moment, he thought he was dreaming. But when he opened his eyes, he saw the German Shepherd. Weak but standing. Slowly pacing through the cabin. She moved stiffly, limping on one leg, but she moved. "Hey, look at you," Daniel said softly. The dog didn't wag her tail. She didn't greet him with joy like most dogs would. Instead, she stopped, looked right at Daniel, and blinked once. Just once. Daniel got up, poured fresh water, and placed some boiled chicken on a plate. The shepherd sniffed, then began to eat, slowly, cautiously, but steadily. It was the first time she'd eaten since the rescue. Daniel crouched down beside her, watching closely. "You're not just smart," he muttered. "You're trained. I can feel it." There was a calmness in her movements. Something deliberate. She didn't flinch at sudden noises. She didn't beg for food. She didn't bark or whine. She simply observed. Analyzed. Like a soldier surveying a new battlefield. Daniel, a former Navy rescue diver, had seen this behavior before, in service dogs. After breakfast, he walked out to his dock. The salty breeze carried memories of the sea. He heard soft footsteps behind him. The shepherd had followed. She stood beside him, staring out at the water where she had nearly died. "You've seen a lot, haven't you?" Daniel said quietly, not turning around. The dog didn't move. Later that day, Daniel called his old friend, a retired K9 handler named Eric. Eric now worked at a private training center. "I need you to meet someone," Daniel said. "Something's not right here, or maybe it's exactly right. But I think this dog was trained." Eric arrived later that afternoon. A tall man with sharp eyes, he stepped into the cabin and crouched down without saying a word. The shepherd stood still. Ears slightly raised, but not aggressive. Eric studied her carefully. "Sit," Eric said calmly. The dog didn't move. "Lie down." Again, no response. But then Eric did something subtle. He extended 2 fingers, palm facing down, and slowly arched them downward. In an instant, the dog dropped to the floor. Her tail tucked slightly, her eyes locked onto Eric. Daniel's eyes widened in shock. What was that? A silent command, Eric replied. It's used in tactical operations. Whoever trained him prepared him for something serious. Eric stood up and looked straight at Daniel. You didn't just rescue a stray. You pulled a service dog from the ocean. Daniel turned toward the German shepherd, who now lay perfectly still, watching them both intently. Why would a trained dog end up 135 miles from shore? He asked quietly. Eric didn't answer. He didn't need to, because the next question was even more unsettling. Who sent him there, and why? That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, staring at the dog resting quietly at the foot of his bed. The broken metal tag with the letter R lay on the table beside him. No chip, no documents, no answers. But now there was something bigger. A mission, a trail, and the terrible possibility that this dog had seen something, or escaped from something, no one was ever meant to know. When Daniel reached out and gently ran his hand down the dog's back, the shepherd leaned into his touch ever so slightly. For the first time, her tail moved just a little. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of it. 2 days later, the shepherd, now responding to the name Ranger, was gaining strength. He followed Daniel around the cabin, rested at his feet, and even nudged his hand for more chicken when he thought no one was watching. But what troubled Daniel most was how Ranger reacted to certain sounds. Not thunder, not fireworks, helicopters. Every time one passed overhead, even faintly, Ranger froze. His ears flattened, his body lowered, and his eyes, those smart, sharp eyes, turned cold and calculating. But traumatized, Daniel couldn't shake the thought. He picked up the broken tag again and stared at the faded R. There had to be more to this story. Dogs didn't just end up in the middle of the ocean. So he did something he hadn't done in years. He pulled out his old laptop, the one he hadn't used since retiring, and logged into a restricted search and rescue database accessible only to military personnel and former contractors. It was risky, but the mystery had consumed him. He entered several filters. German shepherd, military, service dog, no chip, tactical signals, last known operations on the East Coast. What appeared on the screen wasn't public. It was a classified file with a red warning. Operation Nightmark, Animal Agent Recovery Program. Daniel blinked. He had never heard of it. He clicked the file. Access denied. He pushed further, using some old bypass codes from his diving days. Finally, partial access. The screen went black, and white text appeared. Active Agent R7. Breed, German Shepherd. Designation, Offshore Reconnaissance. Handler, Classified. Status, Decommissioned, Presumed Lost at Sea. Deactivation date, 3 days before Daniel found him. Daniel leaned back, stunned. They knew. They knew Ranger was out there, and marked him as lost, not rescued. The file gave no details about who trained him or why he was sent to sea. But one thing was clear. Ranger had been part of something secret, something hidden, and someone didn't want him to be found. Suddenly, Daniel heard movement behind him. Turned. Ranger stood in the hallway, eyes locked on the laptop screen, ears raised. Do you recognize this? Daniel asked softly. The dog didn't move. But Daniel heard it then, unmistakable. The low hum of tires. Gravel crunched beneath tires. Daniel rushed to the window and pulled back the curtain. A black SUV had stopped at the edge of his driveway. No license plates. 2 men stepped out. Plain clothes. One held a small device, the other wore gloves. Ranger started to growl, low, almost silent, but deadly serious. Daniel shut the laptop and stepped back. Someone had been watching the database. And now they were here. Come on, Ranger, he whispered, grabbing his keys. They slipped out the back door, disappearing into the woods behind the cabin. Daniel's old truck was parked further down the trail, just in case. Ranger moved beside him, silent as a shadow, fully alert. Once inside the truck, Daniel glanced at the shepherd. Whatever they did to you, it's not over, is it? Ranger didn't blink. He was ready. Daniel drove, eyes shifting between the road and the rearview mirror. The SUV wasn't tailing them, not obviously. But that didn't mean they weren't being watched. Ranger sat rigid in the passenger seat, ears swiveling at every sound. His body language wasn't panicked. It was calculated. He was processing. Just like Daniel, like a soldier. They left the paved road and followed a dirt path toward an old, remote marina. Daniel had used it during his diving days. Now, it was almost abandoned. Just a few forgotten docks and one rusty storage shed. Perfect. Daniel parked the truck deep in the shadows and killed the engine. "We'll stay here tonight," he whispered. Ranger didn't move, but his breathing slowed. He was conserving energy, waiting. Inside the shed, Daniel laid out a blanket and closed the creaky door behind them. The air smelled of salt and old oil. Ranger sniffed every corner before settling by the entrance, guarding. Always guarding. Daniel sat beside him and finally voiced the question that had haunted him since he first opened the file. "What were you used for, boy?" He didn't expect an answer. But he continued anyway. "I've seen dogs like you. Military trackers, service dogs, even deep-sea operation units. But you're different. You weren't just trained to obey. You were trained to think." Ranger looked at him, eyes deep and aware. And then, he did something Daniel did not expect. The shepherd gently placed his paw on Daniel's boot. A small gesture, but full of meaning. Daniel swallowed. "You trust me now, huh?" A soft sigh escaped the dog. Not quite a breath, but close. That night, they both slept lightly. Ears tuned to every sound, instincts sharp. By dawn, Daniel led Ranger to the dock. He had one final plan, and it was dangerous. "I'm going to find out who sent you," he said, tightening the straps on a dry bag. "But they'll be looking for you now. You'll need to stay hidden." He hesitated. "Unless you want to leave. You've been through hell. I wouldn't blame you if you disappeared into the woods and never looked back." But Ranger stepped forward. He positioned himself between Daniel and the edge of the dock, blocking the way. Ranger locked eyes with him. Words weren't needed. Daniel smiled faintly. "All right, partner." They climbed into a small boat hidden behind the pier. Daniel had used it for dives years ago. Fast, quiet, barely legal, but reliable. As they pulled away, Daniel glanced back at the shore. Half hidden among the trees stood the black SUV. He cursed quietly. They tracked the truck. Ranger stood at the bow, wind rippling through his fur. His eyes were sharp, locked on the shoreline. Suddenly, the SUV's passenger door opened. A figure in black stepped out, face obscured by a cap and sunglasses. He raised a phone to his mouth and spoke into it. Instantly, Ranger barked. Not out of fear. Out of recognition. Daniel looked at him. "You know him?" Ranger barked again, louder this time, pacing on the deck, clearly agitated. "Is that your handler?" No response. Just intense, focused pacing. Daniel turned the boat sharply toward open water. "We're not ready for this." "Not yet." Ranger sat, but never took his eyes off the fading shore. Daniel's eyes stayed fixed on the fading figure. Whoever that man was, friend or foe, one thing was now clear. Ranger remembered, and so the whole world would know. The sea grew rougher than expected as they sped away. Daniel tightened his grip on the wheel as the small boat rocked violently on the waves. The engine groaned under the strain. Ranger stood beside him, paws firmly planted on the deck, eyes locked on the horizon. They had been silent for nearly an hour, but the tension between them was palpable. Ranger was no longer just a mystery. He was now part of something much bigger, and far more dangerous. Finally, Daniel guided the boat into a hidden cove he had used during his diving years. Surrounded by jagged rocks, it was only accessible by water or miles of thick brush. Perfect for hiding. He killed the engine and let silence settle over them. "All right," he muttered, tossing a rope onto the rocky shore. "Time to get some answers." He pulled out the printed copy of the classified file, Active R7. Daniel sat on the boat's bench and read through it again. No names. No locations. Just tactical jargon, coded mission descriptions, and one chilling final entry. Terminated due to compromise. Terminated. They had wanted him dead. But Ranger survived, not by accident, but by sheer will and instinct. By refusing to sink. Daniel reached into the dry bag and pulled out the broken tag they had recovered from Ranger's fur. Salt still clung to the surface, the letter R barely visible. Ranger, Daniel whispered. Was that always your name, or did you become that way? The dog looked at him, not like a pet, like a partner. Suddenly, Ranger stood and moved to the bow. His ears shot up, not in fear, but in recognition. Daniel followed his gaze. A helicopter. But silent. They found us again, Daniel muttered. Ranger let out a low, urgent whine, then leapt off the boat onto the rocks. He sprinted toward a narrow path winding up through the cliffs. Without hesitation, Daniel followed. At the top, they ducked behind a large boulder, just in time to see the helicopter hover briefly before landing a few hundred meters away. The doors slid open. 4 figures stepped out, black tactical gear, helmets, visors, no insignias. But the 5th man stood apart. No helmet, no mask, just a weathered face and calm demeanor. Ranger froze. Daniel glanced at him. You know him, don't you? Ranger's tail lowered, his eyes locked onto the man. Daniel whispered, Looks like I just found your handler. The man surveyed the area, then pulled out a small device. He pressed a button. A sharp pulse rang through the air, almost too high-pitched for human ears. Ranger flinched. He whined, stepping back, pawing at his ears in pain and confusion. Hey, what's happening? Daniel asked urgently, grabbing Ranger's fur, trying to calm him. But the shepherd shook his head violently, clearly distressed. They're trying to reprogram you, Daniel said, his voice tight with anger. The handler raised his hand and pointed directly at the cliff. No words, just a signal. 2 of the armed men immediately started up the path toward them. Daniel grabbed Ranger's harness. Time to go. Now. But Ranger didn't move. He looked at Daniel. Something deep inside him still responded to the signal. Old commands. Old bonds. I know this hurts, Daniel said, tension in every word. But this is your choice now. Not theirs. The signal intensified. Ranger whined again, trembling. Then, with sudden clarity, he barked, sharp and loud, echoing through the cliffs. And he ran. Not back down the trail, but straight toward the helicopter. Ranger, stop. Daniel yelled. But he understood. Ranger wasn't running to join them. He was running to end this. Daniel raced after him, adrenaline pumping. Ranger reached the clearing just as the 2 armed men turned to intercept. Without hesitation, he lunged, clamping onto one man's leg and taking him down. The second reached for his weapon. But Daniel tackled him at full speed, slamming him into the dirt. The first man fell. The second was disarmed. The handler stepped forward and finally spoke. Stand down, R7. Ranger froze. That voice, familiar, echoing from deep within his memory. Return. The mission isn't over. Daniel stood firmly between them. It is now. The handlers studied him carefully. You think you can protect him? He asked coldly. He's not just a dog. He's a classified asset with unresolved protocols. Daniel raised his voice. He's not an asset. He's a survivor. And he's made his choice. Ranger stepped up beside Daniel, eyes locked on his former handler. He growled, not with anger, but with finality. The helicopter's engine roared. One of the armed men shouted something unintelligible, and the team began to pull back. The handler hesitated, meeting Daniel's eyes. You're making a mistake, he said flatly. Daniel nodded calmly. Maybe, but it's our mistake now. The helicopter lifted into the sky. Wind scattered leaves and dust across the clearing until they vanished into the clouds. Daniel looked down at Ranger. The shepherd trembled, but not from pain, from relief. He was free. Together, they quietly made their way back to the boat. The sun was dipping below the horizon as Daniel wrapped Ranger in a towel and leaned back against the deck. You're not R7 anymore, he said softly. You're Ranger. And only you get to decide who you are now. The dog rested his head on Daniel's lap and for the first time, closed his eyes. Not from exhaustion, but because he was safe. A week passed since the standoff at the cliffs. The sea was calm again, the sky soft and bright with spring sunlight. In a quiet coastal town in Florida, the once lonely bay cabin had become something it hadn't been in a long time. A home. Ranger lay sprawled on the porch, head resting lazily on his paws, eyes half closed. A warm breeze carried the scent of salt and jasmine. His body was healing, growing stronger day by day. But more importantly, the tension had left his eyes. The war behind them was over. Daniel stepped out of the cabin with a bowl of grilled chicken and rice. "Hope you're hungry," he said with a grin. "This is the good stuff." Ranger's ears perked up. He stretched slowly and approached, no hesitation, no fear. He ate peacefully, tail swaying gently. When he finished, he sat beside Daniel, watching the waves kiss the shore. Daniel sighed deeply. He still didn't know who the people in the helicopter really were. He hadn't heard from them since. Maybe they gave up. Maybe they were still watching. But the silence didn't feel threatening anymore. It felt like acceptance. "Looks like they surrendered," Daniel said quietly. "Guess they figured you're home now." Ranger blinked slowly, then pressed closer to Daniel's leg. Later that day, they headed into town. At a small pet store on the main street, they were greeted with a surprise. The owner, Linda, met them with a warm smile. "You must be Ranger," she said, crouching to meet his eyes. "You've become quite the legend around here." Ranger sniffed her hand politely and wagged his tail. Linda held up a leather collar with gold embossing. On the front, it read only one word, Ranger. Daniel accepted it quietly, kneeling to fasten it gently around the shepherd's neck. "There," he whispered. "Your real name. No codes. No numbers. Just you." Their next stop was the beach. Not the open sea, where Ranger had once fought to survive, but a peaceful, sandy shore where small waves lapped gently and children's laughter filled the air. Ranger stepped cautiously onto the sand. The ocean's sound no longer made him flinch. Daniel tossed a ball down the beach. Ranger hesitated, then bolted after it. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't fast. But it was freedom. When he returned, panting with his tongue hanging out, Daniel laughed aloud. "You're officially a beach dog now," he said, beaming. As the sun set, they returned home. Golden light filled the cabin, turning everything warm and peaceful. Ranger curled up at the foot of the porch. Daniel sat beside him, resting his hand on the shepherd's back. They stayed like that in silence for a long time. 'Cause sometimes, the strongest moments need no words. Not every rescue begins with a plan. Not every hero wears a badge. And not everything broken stays broken. Sometimes all it takes is choosing to begin again. All he needed was to be found. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to backhand index pointing right, subscribe to the channel. Backhand index pointing right, like this video. Backhand index pointing right and share it with someone who believes in second chances. Ranger's journey reminds us all, no matter how lost we may feel, there is always a way home.